Matchmaker.fm connects podcasters and guests. Welcome to Matched, the show where we talk to some of the most incredible guests available for an interview right now. I'm your host, James Mulvany, founder of Matchmaker.fm, and this is Matched.
Hi, I'm Sam, and you can find me on Matchmaker.fm.
Welcome to Match, Sam. How's it going?
It's going very well. How is it going with you?
Yeah, good, thanks. So, let's start off with a couple of icebreakers. Have you ever been told you look like someone famous? If so, who was it?
I used to have the awful thing when I was in primary school with really like cheap Specsavers glasses where everyone would, oh, you look like Harry Potter, which really was just that I had dark hair and I couldn't see, which is somewhat disappointing because I don't. Turn the question on you. Have you, other than radio's James Mulvany?
Yeah. I used to get when I was at school. Macaulay Culkin was the one I used to.
The question: young or old Macaulay Culkin? Because that's either.
Well, probably young, like Home Alone days. I was at school in the 90s. Yeah, no, not now. This was in the 90s when Home Alone was rife, which it still is really. But there we go. But yeah, that was what I got called. And Macaulay Culkin, so basically just a bit of a nerdy kid. Similar to what you just said. Wore glasses, sort of a bad, sort of dodgy blonde haircut kind of thing. All right, so I guess just start off. Just introduce yourself. Tell us how you kind of came to be and what you do.
Yeah, so on a cold night in 1997. No, that's how I came to be. No, what I do, more importantly, I am, loosely speaking, I'm an evolutionary biologist, and I study how. Well, I study a thing called Evo-Devo, and what that is it's studying evolutionary biology through the lens of development. So all animals, no matter what they are, all plants as well, start as a single cell, and then over time they divide and they specialize into whatever they're going to become, the species they'll become. And obviously over time, these species have radiated and you've got millions of species, many of which are now extinct. But the thing I specifically study is at what point in time during that developmental process, from a single cell through to when you've got potentially millions, billions of cells, does a species start to look like itself? Does it become the individual species? So I study this group of fish called cichlids, which are wonderful because there are thousands of them and they have really, really diverse faces. And the problem I'm studying is that when does a cichlid's face become the face of that specific cichlid rather than just being a normal fish? And in doing so, then we can potentially work out when every other animal with bones, every vertebrate, or sharks too, becomes itself, when its face becomes its own face. So yeah, it's a very... That's the best way to explain it. There's a little bit more complicated stuff in there, but yeah, I'll go with that. That's what I do. And on the side, I talk to interesting scientists about what they do to try to escape from the interesting or boring science I might be doing at that point in time.
Right, that's it's really interesting. I must admit, before you came on, I had to Google a couple of these terms because I was like, "What even is that?" But I was looking at all these diagrams of fish, and it does look really fascinating.
Yeah, it's especially interesting because this group of fish, these cichlids, I've said there's thousands of them, but they are arguably the fastest evolving group of species in the world. So Charles Darwin, when he put together his book on the origin, he was looking at these finches in the Galapagos Islands, and there's 14 species of these finches. And he was saying that they're amazingly diverse. But the impressive thing with cichlids is in the same time frame that those finches have evolved into 14 species from one, these cichlids have evolved into thousands of species from a single species. So they're evolving incredibly quickly, and they're all so distinct. So their faces, their patterning, beautiful. They're the kind of fish you see in like fish shops, but they're really, really amazing. So they're a great system to study the problem of sort of when does species become species, because there's so many of them, and you can just pick and choose the ones you want to look at because, yeah.
Okay, so tell us how you kind of got into podcasts.
Yeah, so I suppose really it's a harvest. Basically, when I was a kid, I'd watch a lot of like science TV, and there was always a common theme, and that's that science TV was normally presented by people who look a bit like me. They're middle class white dudes. And even when you look at TV, so my brother's favourite film when he was a kid was Jurassic Park. And like Ian Malcolm, there's Jeff Goldblum and Rich Attenborough's character are obviously scientists, and similarly, they're white men. Throughout history, you look at images, paintings, pictures of scientists, and they all look very similar. And that's sort of a problem because, like, it's great for me. If I want to become a scientist, I can find plenty of people who are like me. But there's a lot of people for whom that's not the case, namely 50% of the population being women, and then other sort of ethnic groups. So I thought, like, this isn't right, because that might be TV or film, but when I'm at university or I'm going to a scientific conference, that's not necessarily the picture that you see. So these people exist, but they're not given a platform. And what I wanted to do was show people that basically anyone can be a scientist, no matter what they look like, where they're from, and regardless of what they're interested in. There's not just one kind of scientist who looks like me, wears a lab coat, and pours chemicals into each other. So the idea for the podcast basically came from just wanting to demonstrate that science is actually a really diverse, interesting place, as much as it doesn't necessarily seem like it from the outside. And then generally the idea to actually make it into a podcast was I listened to a lot of No Such Thing as a Fish. It's my favorite podcast. And I was like, actually, maybe I could, do something like this. And I was like, no, I can't, because it's already been done. But what else could I do? And so I took these two ideas and went, well, let's stick it together, put it in audio format, and see what happens.
Yeah. So tell us about your podcast.
About my podcast. So the podcast is called Sit Down with a Scientist. And it is what it says on the tin. I sit down, or used to sit down in the same room as someone, have a chat with them about what they do. So really it's about their work now, to demonstrate that, you can do anything. I've had volcanologists, I've had people studying 4-dimensional printing, but I've also had people who aren't necessarily doing scientific research, so scientific artists, people doing like community science projects.
Yeah.
So I talked to them about what they do and then how they got there, because I think it's really interesting to find out, or to see someone that's like you, who's come from a similar background to you, who was interested in the same things as you as a kid. They may not necessarily have been some maths genius, just to demonstrate that anyone can do this. And then often we go off on tangents about whatever's happening in science at that point in time as well, or more general issues. But the bigger thing is it's about basically just demonstrating the diversity of people. It's like building a portfolio of amazing people in science who normally you wouldn't see, but definitely exist because I'm finding them somehow.
Okay, and why did you join Matchmaker?
Okay, so I'd restarted this. I started the podcast last year, and then it died as I was doing far too much other stuff. But then in March, I was like, well, I've suddenly got a bit more time, and I might as well just get back on this. And then every week I was spending hours just like scrolling through Twitter, desperately trying to find science communicators or scientists who I could send a message to and hope they'd get back to me. But the problem was, in the majority of cases, they wouldn't. Either they'd have their DMs closed, or they wouldn't see my message, or they'd be too busy. And then in early July, you sent me a message on LinkedIn. I think you'd launched Matchmaker earlier in the year. And I thought, actually, this is a really good idea, because it gets rid of the whole having to, first of all, I can contact anyone that's on the platform. And second of all of those people already want to do podcasts. Like, you're not having to open the conversation with, oh, this is what I do, would you possibly be interested? It's, oh, these people probably are interested, and then it's me who gets to pick and choose between the people who are a good fit. So really that was it. It was that I was spending far too much time doing outreach, which I still do, because not everyone is on Matchmaker yet. Yet being the key word, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But, it's been really, really useful just to find interesting people without having to put in quite so much legwork, because there is a lot of legwork in running an interview podcast.
There is, yeah. And so I'm curious to know, because obviously you've got a very specific niche that you're in. How have you found it in terms of, have you been able to find good, relevant guests for your podcast?
So I've had a few really good ones, a few really diverse people as well. So obviously science itself is a niche, and normally scientists are too busy to bother doing anything outside of their research because they work 7-day weeks. But I think the most interesting person I found was this amazing lady called Anna Pajajski. And Anna Pajajski is a materials scientist. So basically she studies, the science of everything we use on the day-to-day. And she was studying this, I think, for her PhD or her postdoc. She was studying four-dimensional printing. So you have 3D printing, where you make a 3D object. 4D, it's something that can change through time. So they're made from smart materials. But anyway, and Anna was, first of all, an amazing podcast guest, and runs her own podcast called, I think it's called the Handmade podcast, which is definitely worth checking out if you care about house, like anything. But she was an amazing guest, but actually it ended up branching out into something more. So she is really well connected to this amazing science comedian called Steve Cross. And now I'm doing some work with him. And also he runs a thing called Talent Factory, which I'm now a part of, which is all about doing science communication better, doing communication better. So I've had some wonderful guests. I've also had people working in oil engineering, and epidemiologists, which was incredibly useful back when we still wanted to talk about COVID. Now I don't want to talk about that anymore. But yeah.
No, don't blame you. Okay, that's great to hear. And that's really good feedback as well. So thanks very much.
No worries.
I've got, so what do you think? So this is quite a broad question, I guess. What do you think podcasting can bring to the scientific community?
Okay, so I think science, and it's something that gets said a lot, but science has a big communication issue. And that big communication issue is that really the only time people actually interact with scientists, they interact with scientists' work all the time just by existing. Every time you pick up a phone, you're interacting with a scientist's work. But the only time they actually interact with scientists is probably on television. And generally, if you look at the kind of people who present television, they all tend to look very similar or be from a very similar background. Perhaps they went to Oxford or Cambridge. And that's a problem for kids who want to be scientists but don't see themselves doing science, right? Because they can't just walk into a university and see someone. A lot of people think Twitter was a solution to this, in that, like, oh, you could have science communicators with 70, 80,000 followers. But when all of those followers are scientists themselves, it's sort of a useless audience because you're communicating to the converted. You're not going to be necessarily supporting kids in becoming scientists because everyone who reads your tweets is already a scientist. I think something that podcasts have over Twitter and all these other conventional media platforms is that anyone can access them. So if you can produce a podcast, it can be science light. And this is what I like to call, like, No Such Thing as a Fish, the QI Elves podcast. It's science light. It's about science and it can get people interested in science, but it's not the boring data-y stuff. It's the fun side of science. Yeah. And I think podcasts are fantastic for that because anyone can accidentally find them. And it's a really easy platform to blend things like comedy with science, which makes it more bearable. So really, podcasts are such a powerful platform for just making science accessible. It doesn't have to be boring, stuffy people working in the lab all day doing an interview on ITV about the new COVID vaccine. It can just be a bunch of funny people chatting funny things and occasionally talking about their favorite animal or whatever else. And it just provides an easy access point to the difficult thing, which can be science and science communication. And anyone can do it. That's the other thing. It's the great equalizer. Like conventional media, you have to be invited to be on it. Whereas within a podcast, it's like, well, anyone can start one and anyone can be interviewed on one. So it's like open access science, which is something that I think is really important.
Great. Yeah, I completely agree. And, you make a really good point because you see the same people coming up on TV, for example, like BBC News or whatever, they'll always go to the same few experts if they want to discuss a particular topic, they'll always have like a go-to person that they get in, whether that be science or technology. Whereas, podcasting just brings much more diversity.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So just to wrap up, if you could be on any other podcast as a guest, which one would it be?
This is difficult. Can I say inadvertently two that are basically the same and then an extra one? Because I don't want to make a choice. You want, so inevitably either Museum of Curiosity or No Such Thing as a Fish, because my dream job would be to be a researcher on QI. I think it'd be amazing. And I have been collecting absurd facts since I was a small child. The other would be Ologies with Ali Ward, which is wonderful as just a display of the diversity of science and like interesting, funny people in it. So yeah, those would be my top 2-3 picks. That's my favorite podcast is those three.
Yeah, great. Okay, Sam, and just to finish off, if you could give some advice to someone who's maybe thinking about starting a podcast or going into podcasting as a scientist, what would it be?
It's overdone, but just do it. Just get a pair of headphones. You don't even need to buy a microphone. You just get put on a pair of headphones and start talking. And eventually, when you throw enough rubbish at the wall, someone will pick it up and like it. That's all there is to it, right? I hope.
Quantity.
Yeah.
Being persistent.
Exactly. Yeah. And just think at it, even if it's not going to plan or it's a bit rubbish. Everyone starts out a bit rubbish. If you look at the first episode of any podcast, Joe Rogan, right? Biggest podcast in the world.
Yes.
it's not great. It's just that he's funny, but it's not what it is now. But it's grown into what it is now, and that just takes time and effort and a lot of persistence.
And I think it's just like anything, isn't it? Practice is perfect, and practice makes perfect. And you just, the more you do it, the more confident you become, and the better you guess at it as well. Like, you just have a good active listening ear too. I think it's a good advice. Totally. It's just like listening back to yourself. Cool. Okay. And just to finish up, how can people find out more about you? How can people tune into your podcast?
So you can find more about me on Twitter at @SJ_McKay. And my podcast, if you just search for Sit Down with a Scientist, it normally pops up. Otherwise, you can go to wherever your podcasts live and just desperately type things like Sit Down with a Scientist, and hopefully eventually one of them will come up with an awful illustration of my face next to it. So that's the easiest way to do it. Spotify. We'll call it Spotify. Why not?
Sam, thanks very much for your time.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
There is an easier way to get booked onto more podcasts as a guest. Join matchmaker.fm for free today and start making connections with podcasters who are looking for guests just like you.